Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with Pippa Crerar, political editor of The Guardian, and Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. Welcome both. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's take a quick look at what is on some of those front pages. Unsurprisingly, one story is dominating. The damning inquiry report into the infected blood scandal leads the Daily Mail with this headline, "Day that shames the British state." This is the front of the Telegraph with an almost identical headline. The condemnation continues on the front of the Express. The Guardian now, and again, those words used in the Commons apology by Rishi Sunak, a day of shame. The Times too uses the same phrase, which has come to define the reaction to today's report into the scandal, and the Eye once more calling it a day of shame. The Metro describes it as 40 years of bloody cover-up. The Mirror says that it's time to make those who were guilty in the scandal face justice. Meanwhile, the Financial Times leads with the International Criminal Court calling for the arrest of Israel's Prime Minister and the leader of Hamas for alleged war crimes in the current conflict. And a reminder that, as always, by scanning the QR code that you see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us talk about them. And as I mentioned, we are joined tonight by Pippa Crerar, political editor of The Guardian, and Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I mean, obviously, there is just one story. It's on all the front pages. Let's just start with the Mirror front page. Headline there, infected blood scandal, and, the pictures of, just some of the, more than 3,000 people who've lost their lives. Pippa, your reaction to the report?
So what was really powerful to think about today was that, as the Prime Minister said, the focus should be on the families, on the victims and their loved ones, and remembering the 3,000 people who died, the 30,000 people who had been infected, and sort of, leave the compensation and the politics and what comes next until tomorrow. And I think actually of all the front pages, the Mirror does this most strikingly with just some of those stories of people that died. And if I could just pick out one, the little boy in the bottom right of that front page, Colin Smith, who was born with haemophilia and was given factor VIII and by his medics, which, as we know now, was farmed from prisoners, drug addicts and sex workers in the States. He ended up being infected with HIV, and his parents didn't notice, or the medics didn't realise until he started dramatically losing weight. And of course, at that point, his condition deteriorated, and there was no coming back from it. He died when he was 7, but the trauma that the parents had to go through, not just losing their little boy, but the way that the reaction, bearing in mind it was the late 1980s, to the fact that their child developed AIDS. And they were known by some neighbours as the AIDS family. They had 6-foot letters written across their front door, AIDS dead, with crosses scraped on the door. And in the end, they decided to bring him home to die, because that's where they felt safest, despite the fact that they had this awful attacks because of the condition he had, through no fault of his own. And that's just one story. But every single one of those people on the front page, and thousands more, will also have had similarly awful
we actually
stories.
had a report on that little boy, Colin Smith, on Sky, and his father said one thing that really stayed with me, that I don't think he used the word guilt, but he just had this, he just felt awful that he had given his son, that effectively, he, not knowing, had ended up giving his son what ended up killing him, by going to the doctors and trusting. I mean, that's another word that comes up a lot, the trust that's been broken.
Yes, and I think it's very interesting that Sunak decided in his common statement to go down that line of blaming the doctors, blaming the medics and the NHS, reflecting what Sir Brian Langstaff had said in terms of that trust being broken. These were doctors who were entrusted with the care, in some cases of children, adults, to ensure that they could receive the right treatment, whether it be a blood transfusion or whatever. And instead of actually putting patients first. In some cases, like that report you had from the Trelaws Special Needs School, they were using children without their consent or their parents' consent, effectively as guinea pigs for their own experiments to find out which treatments work best. I mean, this is possibly one of the worst days in the NHS's history that I can ever remember, going back since its inception after the Second World War. I mean, I'm thinking about what happened in Mid-Staffordshire as well as being another horrific day for the NHS. And it's difficult to see now, you know, where does the NHS go from here in terms of rebuilding that trust with the British public? And that's not just a question for Mr Sunak, but it soon could be a question for Sir Keir Starmer as well, as he actually almost tried to, in his reply to Rishi Sunak, tried to, in effect, defend the NHS to some extent by saying actually politicians of all political hues had to accept some of the blame as well.
Let's take a look at some of the other front pages. So The Guardian, day of shame, deadly cover-up of blood scandal finally exposed. Of course, the cover-up compounding the pain of all the infected and affected. And then if we can just take a look at the Daily Mail as well. Front page there, day that shames the British state. Pippa, again, this word that keeps on coming up, shame.
Yes, because it wasn't just the terrible mistakes that were made by infecting so many innocent people and the impact it had on their lives. It was also, as Theo suggested, what happened next. And the fact that it was, as Brian Langstaff said today, this chilling is the word that he used, the Mail picks up here, cover-up that hid the truth for many years. There are examples both from the clinicians, from NHS leaders, and also from ministers, where individuals at all those three levels made public statements, made promises to patients and to the public about the state of play, which turned out not to be true. So, suggesting, for example, that the blood which had been imported from the States had been I don't know the phrase for heat screened, so basically to remove any sort of virus that might be in it. They said that was happening, but it didn't happen, for another couple of years, and that's because there wasn't the money there to do it. So it was this culture where, rather than sort of confronting this terrible disaster which had unfolded, there was a sort of like a let's all close in and try and protect ourselves, whether that's in the NHS, whether that's in the government, and that is really a sort of the awful. Compounded the agony of all these families, that there wasn't sort of the responsibility taken for it sooner.
And I think the Mail's picked up on this to some extent by saying their fears that no one will ever face criminal justice for what has happened. And of course, these cover-ups serve a very pernicious purpose, and that is always to make it much more difficult to actually seek justice through the criminal courts for those responsible. Because if you're trying to prosecute somebody for something that happened 40 years ago, in a historic case, when you have such a high threshold as for somebody to be proven guilty as beyond all reasonable doubt, it's very difficult to do when you're testing, what happened, trying to find out exactly what happened during a cross-examination of somebody trying to recollect or recall what happened such a long time ago. And now there are real fears from the families that after this cover-up, where they felt belittled, they felt lied to, they felt that the truth was being hidden from them. It wasn't just that. Actually, what we're probably going to see, and this is the real tragic consequence, and we saw it with Hillsborough as well, that actually it'll be very difficult now for those responsible to face justice in front of the courts.
Let me just bring up the front page of the Financial Times, which has a slightly different angle to it. Sunak promises whatever it costs to redress infected blood scandal misery. Of course, the Prime Minister issued a wholehearted, unequivocal apology, sounding very sincere in the House of Commons. Whatever it costs, Pippa, it's about compensation at this point as well.
Yes, and we're expecting tomorrow to hear more from John Glenn, the Cabinet Office Minister, spelling out exactly what compensation the government will offer. Sunak here has promised to spend our money, obviously, whatever it costs to redress this. Whatever it costs seems to be in the region of about £10 billion, which is obviously a huge amount of money. But would have to be, given the constrained financial or economic circumstances in which the country is in, would be paid for by borrowing. Yeah. And what's crucial, I think, is that Labour has said that they would, whatever process the government puts in place, because they want to do it sooner rather than later, they say, Labour has said that it would follow through. So the fact that there's got cross-party unity on this, it won't be sort of like political ding-dong of where the money comes from. But it does probably mean some choices for the Chancellor, because even if he's doing it via borrowing, and it's sort of, in accounting terms, it's been put as capital expenditure, it will mean potentially that there's less money available for, other choices that you might want to make going into the election, like tax rises and so on. So there has been a political choice there. And I think it's also worth quickly saying that while Rishi Sunak stood up there in the chamber today and said they'd spend whatever it costs, the Hull MP that had done a huge amounts of campaigning on this, made the point to him that there was an interim report in 2022 which recommended that compensation should be paid out. And they started, I think they paid out to 4,000 people, got £100,000 compensation. They started that process. But it didn't go as far as what was recommended. And the man who was Chancellor at that point was, and then obviously Prime Minister, was of course Rishi Sunak. So he could, and the point was made in the chamber and by Brian Langstaff, those payments could have come earlier. So there was even more pressure, I think, on the government now actually to deliver what it's promising.
Whatever it costs is almost the easy bit. It's about making sure that these payments are timely. And we've seen that from the post office scandal and what's happened there, that actually those who are affected, the victims who are affected, are not necessarily saying they want a particular amount of money or a sum of money. They're not greedy, they're not avaricious, and they want some sum of money that they think they deserve. They actually just want to receive that payment. They want to receive the justice that they so rightly deserve. And that's the question now. We're looking ahead to what's announced tomorrow, and possibly, as Pippa said, the money's got to come from somewhere, whether that's more borrowing or some accountancy in an emergency budget. But it's just about how quickly that money now comes online for the victims.
Absolutely.
I think,
Timing
as well.
is also key. Theo, Pippa, thank you so much for that. Now stay with us. Coming up, among the other stories that we'll be discussing, this on the front of the Telegraph about Joe Biden condemning a decision by the International Criminal Court to seek the arrest of the Israeli Prime Minister. Its headline, US condemns ICC calls for Netanyahu arrest warrant. We will be right back. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now. Pippa Crerar, political editor of The Guardian, and Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. OK, let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news in tomorrow's paper. Let's look at the Daily Telegraph. The US condemns ICC calls for Netanyahu arrest warrant. So the decision by the ICC to seek the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu for alleged war crimes, and not just him, and that's what the prosecutor is asking for, but also, I think, 3 leaders of Hamas, including Yahya Sinwar. Let me just bring you some breaking news that links into this story from the Reuters news agency. President Biden saying what's happening in Gaza is not genocide. Theo, what do you make of the Biden reaction or this call from the ICC anyway?
I think the Joe Biden reaction is actually he's being more hawkish towards the conflict in the Middle East than he has been previously. And listening to him, unequivocally say, as you reveal that breaking news, that it's not genocide what's happening in Gaza, is him taking a harder line in support of Israel, where actually in recent weeks and months, he's actually softened somewhat to take the White House has often been criticised by Israel for being more neutral than Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu would have liked. So I think that's interesting. I think also what's interesting is there seems to be something, although we were discussing this before, Pippa, of a split between what the British government's saying and Joe Biden. British government simply saying it's unhelpful, and actually what we should be focusing on in the Middle East is ensuring there's humanitarian aid can reach the civilians affected by the conflict, and ensuring the release of the hostages, rather than necessarily trying to draw equivalents, as Joe Biden has said that the ICC is doing in terms of between what happened on October the 7th and Israel's reaction to Hamas.
Let me just quickly bring up the front page of the Times as well. Same story, and of course Netanyahu's fury at war crimes allegation. Pippa.
Well, of course, I think he's referring to 2 different things here. There's the International Criminal Court, which is focused on individuals that potentially are responsible for war crimes. And as the Times says here, on the Israeli side, these are crimes including starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willful killing, and intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population in their response to the October 7th attacks. And then the separate issue of the International Court of Justice, where, as we know, South Africa has tried to take a case, or trying to get them to launch a case into whether Israel is responsible for genocide. So his remarks refer to that separate court procedure rather than to the ICC. But as Theo says, what I think is really interesting with the way that Biden has responded here is that it is much more, it is much less equivocal than he has been, and he's been very critical, particularly in recent weeks, over the potential of Israeli troops going into Rafah, where 1 million Palestinians are housed, even to the extent where he suggested that they would withdraw military support, some weapons, should the Israelis decide to do that. And then, just as Theo mentioned, I think briefly it's worth us, from a UK perspective, looking at what at the Labour response to this, because potentially they're the next government in a few months' time. And it was very significant in the Commons today, David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, suggesting that the independence of the ICC must be respected.
We're going to have to leave it there.